So welcome all to today's webinar on the human rights obligations of states and non-state actors. We really appreciate you for taking your time off your busy schedules to discuss this very important topic. My name is June Cynthia Okello, and I am a qualified advocate of the High Court of Kenya with a postgraduate diploma in law from the Kenya School of Law. I am also currently undertaking a postgraduate diploma in tax administration from the Kenya School of Revenue Administration in Kenya. And I also hold a bachelor's of law degree from Kabarak University. Well, I work as an economic governance associate at the Pan-African Lawyers Union. And at PALU, I leverage my skills and expertise in tax law and administration and corporate and commercial practice to provide economic governance support at PALU. So just a few housekeeping rules, and then we can introduce our panelists to begin their presentation. So,
je vais vous demander de fermer vos
request our panelists to turn on their cameras if able to when presenting. Also, there is simultaneous interpretation. There's a toggle button at the bottom of the screen where you can choose your preferred language. The session will run for about 1 hour, and there'll be plenary at the end. So you can post your questions and comments in the Q&A or comment section. So let's make the session as interactive as possible. As we discuss this topic, yes, we are all facing a pandemic, and it is called the illicit flow of finances pandemic. So to start us off, we have our main presenter. Ms. Asha Ramgobin is from South Africa and is the executive director and co-founder of the Human Rights Initiative, lecturer with the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. She has practiced as an advocate at the bar and holds a Master of Law degree in International Human Rights Law from Land or Lund, if I pronounce that correctly, University in Sweden. She has more than 27 years of experience within the access to justice movement in South Africa, within the African continent and internationally. She received an honorary doctorate from the University of Gothenburg, Sweden, in recognition of her work with the university based to strengthen organizations in more than 20 countries in Africa. She is dedicated to promoting social justice, the rights of marginalized groups, and community development. She's a person who connects dots and is enthusiastic about learning to better engage in social justice network. Consequently, 11 years ago, when she learned about the revenue loss through illicit financial flows from Africa, she immersed herself into this subject as a human rights issue and wrote, taught, and advocated for it to be addressed as such. She started reading for a doctorate of laws on international law and tax havens soon after she turned 50, and now at 55 will complete it. She has been an anti-apartheid activist from her youth and continues to dedicate her work towards furthering egalitarian values and fighting justice. Welcome, Ms. Asha. I will also introduce Mr. Mbala, Jean Mbala from Cameroon. He's an agricultural engineer, holds a Master of Science in Agricultural Education at the University of Reading, Executive Director of CRADEC, which is the African Regional Center for Endogenous and Community Development, under Cameroonian law. He has experience in development in the sector of agriculture, planning, public finance, and the SDGs. He has been working for around 10 years on tax justice and illicit financial flows for optimal and effective financing of sustainable development goals. In addition, being a founding member of the Tax Justice Network Africa, a member of the EITI Association, and a member of the Cameroonian Coalition of Publish What You Pay, Jean is also a member of PALU's Task Force on IFFs. Welcome, Mr. Jean Mbala. Also, I would like to introduce our last and final panelist, Ms. Edith Maseriti Nyabicha, who is the policy analyst for East Africa at Global Financial Integrity, GFI, She works to expand GFI's footprint in East Africa and is part of the Africa policy team that collaboratively analyzes illicit financial flows and beneficial ownership. Edith is a dedicated policy expert and enthusiast and has a strong passion for creating positive societal change through effective policy solutions. With her extensive knowledge and expertise, public policy and governance. Throughout her career, Edith has held various positions that have allowed her to contribute significantly to policy development and analysis. She began her journey as a senior policy analyst at Competition Authority of Kenya, where she conducted in-depth research on key policy issues and contributed to the formulation of evidence-based recommendation. In this role, she collaborated with multidisciplinary teams to evaluate existing policies, identify gaps, and propose innovative solutions to address pressing societal changes. Edith later transitioned to American Chamber of Commerce as a policy lead under the Prosper Africa USAID program, where she exerted her expertise in policy analysis and her commitment to making a positive impact that have resulted in numerous notable contributions and achievements. She has authored influential policy briefs, research papers, and op-eds. She has been recognized for their clarity, rigor, and innovative recommendations. Her expertise includes analyzing and evaluating policies and programs, conducting qualitative and quantitative research, and identifying areas. Additionally, she has been invited to speak at national and international conferences where she has shared her insights and recommendations on a range of policy issues. Welcome so much to our panelists. And we want to give the floor to our main presenter, Ms. Asha Ramgomi, who will take us through the human rights obligations of states and non-states actors in curbing illicit financial flows. Welcome.
Thank you very much, June. Just give me a second to start sharing my screen. I just want confirmation that you can see my screen.
Yes, you can see your
see?
screen. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll start my video as well. Thank you very, very much to you and to Palu for initiating this webinar series. I think illicit financial flows is not getting the attention within the human rights sector that it needs to. And just yesterday, I participated just in the hybrid, listened into the UNDP process looking at tax for SDGs. And they began this project in 2020, shortly after COVID. And one of the participants, I think it was a participant from Nigeria, who said, it's all well and good that we started now, but it's really very late, especially when we knew about illicit financial flows and we understood the magnitude of the resources, the revenue that we were losing on this continent, and where we actually, not just this continent, globally, and we actually knew exactly how much we needed. So it is great that we are gathering here today, and I really hope that it continues, that our focus on illicit financial flows and human rights continues. So let me just get started with today's session and share with you that the root of this conversation that we will be having today flows has its roots in the business and human rights framework. And so hoping that there are many lawyers and members of Palu online with us today, I would just like us to briefly remember where this whole business and human rights framework actually comes from. And if we actually look a bit into history, we will realize that not long ago, we were talking about corporate social responsibility, and we were talking about a voluntary form of regulating business. There were two schools, you could say, the corporate social responsibility side, where it was a voluntary side, and then the corporate accountability school, where this group of academics, practitioners, lawyers, international lawyers were suggesting that corporate accountability needs to be regulated, and that the actual basis for them thinking that way lies in a very, very old 18th century statement, where a Lord Chancellor of England said, "Did you ever expect a corporation to have a conscience when it has no soul to be damned and no body to be kicked?" That even when we have human beings with souls to be damned and bodies to be kicked, it is very difficult to regulate, to just have society self-regulating. And so we do need laws, we do need rules, and we do need we need a state to, in a sense, enforce those laws, enforce those rules, so that we have order in society. And similarly, if not more importantly, at a corporate level, it wasn't enough to look at corporate social responsibility from a voluntary perspective.
Sur un plan ou sous une
system, and there were arguments for self-regulation, but in the end, these sorts of realities, on the one hand, you have Nike and its sweatshops and consumers coming out basically and saying, once the sweatshops, Nike sweatshops were exposed in the media, consumers came out and said, stop it, instead of just do it, just stop it. I'm not sure, I don't think any of my slides actually show that, but that's one of the slogans that people came out, consumers came out and said, and boycotted Nike products because of the sweatshops that they had been manufacturing in Asia. We don't see the same kind of resistance and the same sort of consumer activism when it comes to coltan and the atrocities in the eastern part of DRC. It is being, the war in the eastern part of DRC is fought on the basis of coltan. You can see the picture where you have corporations in cahoots with military style governments, exploiting people, exploiting children, and you don't have the same sort of response from consumers and from the general public. And so the need for regulation of corporations has become clearer and clearer. And so you would see, I mentioned the Nike situation, but beyond Nike, the Netherlands and the UK, at one point, they linked export credit guarantees to companies who fulfill their potential, who address potential human rights impacts of their projects. This is before the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and you had investment funds that were actually advertising the ethical dimensions, like Body Shop, for example, advertised its ethical, environmental conscience, its fair trade practices to attract investment. And so that, those were some of the developments that took place before the final adoption of the UN guiding principles on corporate accountability in the 2000s. And here, it rests on three pillars: the respect, protect, and remedy pillar. The state duty to protect, the corporate responsibility to respect, and victims' access to effective remedies. These are the three pillars upon which the UN guiding principles are based. And this is what we're going to be talking about. How can we harness the UN guiding principles, norms in the African human rights field to actually address illicit financial flows? So I'm now looking at the UN guiding principles. I'm going to be looking at some standards within the human rights, African regional human rights system, before finally getting to the recommendations on illicit financial flows. So coming back to the UN guiding principles then, as I said, the framework is based on the state obligation to respect, to protect, the corporate responsibility to respect, and the victim's right to remedy, right? What's very important is that we understand that the framework is actually rooted within what is called principled pragmatism. It's not completely on principle. It's not the usual normative framework. It is basically pragmatism, principled pragmatism. It gives us a middle way between responsibility and accountability. It doesn't give us the type of accountability that some of us would have wanted. It is not completely voluntary and it is not completely regulatory, but it is a mixture of both. And what is very, very important is that it does not create any new legal obligations. The UN guiding principles on business and human rights do not create any new legal obligations. What that working group basically did, and the Ruggie team did, was to look at international human rights norms and standards and how they were at that time and apply them to the situation of business, the human rights responsibilities of business. And because of all of this, because it was a principled pragmatism, because it was the middle way, because it was a mix of voluntary and regulatory, because it created no new legal obligations, it was then unanimously adopted by the Human Rights Council, unlike the resolution on a binding legal treaty, which to regulate business, international business, where you had many abstentions. The proposal was put forward by Ecuador and South Africa, but with many abstentions and many other countries voting against that resolution. In this, when it came to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, it was adopted unanimously because of the sort of compromise position that it presented. So just to unpack the framework a little, the state duty to protect requires the state to adopt policies, regulation, and laws, regulations, and to adjudicate where there have been violations. Okay, that is the state duty to protect. And you will find that the state duty to protect is the same when it comes to the right to health. It's the same when it comes to the right to education. The duty to protect is the duty to protect a potential victim of a human rights violation, a rights holder, from violations by third parties or by the state itself. That duty to protect is embedded within the human rights framework, the international human rights framework. It's nothing new. It's just that in the context of business and human rights, it requires certain things, and that's what certain interventions, and we're going to come to that in a second or two. Corporate responsibility to respect. Here, it's about the corporations acting with due diligence, avoiding infringements, addressing adverse impacts on human rights, basically doing no harm. And this too is something that is pretty normal within the international human rights framework. It is nothing new. Access to remedy, effective access for victims, and we looking at judicial and non-judicial remedies, right? Again, nothing new, but very important within the context of business and human rights. So what does this state duty to protect entail? It requires that the state take steps to prevent, to investigate, to punish, and to redress abuses. And how is it meant to do that? Through adopting effective policies, effective laws, regulations, and adjudication. And this is the state duty to protect against human rights abuses within their territory or jurisdiction by any third parties. And this obviously includes business enterprises, right? The corporate duty to respect. This is really a game changer, even though it doesn't say anything new. There's no new obligations created or new rights created. But when it comes to business, these are important principles that have been introduced. Firstly, do no harm. Address human rights impacts of your activities before you actually begin. So do a human rights impact assessment so that before you actually begin business, you have anticipated some of the risks that you face and you've taken mitigating steps to address those risks. Okay, the scope of this relates to all rights. It's not one particular right, the right to health or the right to a clean and healthy environment. The scope addresses it basically covers all rights within the Bill of Rights: civil and political, social, economic, and cultural, all of them, people's rights as well as individual rights. The corporate duty to respect entails avoiding, causing, or contributing. So not only being a direct cause, but also contributing to human rights violations, and then preventing and mitigating the negative impacts from business relationships as well. So it's the value chain, not just the actual mining company that's extracting, but also the company that the mining company, the main Anglo-American, let's say, or Rio Tinto, the company that they then subcontract to do the drilling or to do other small elements of the mining activity. Prevention, the causing and contributing, preventing and mitigating, is spread across all the business relationships, right? And it applies to all companies. It has implications for both policies and processes that companies adopt. Due diligence processes, which is a requirement under the Business and Human Rights Framework, requires corporations to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how human rights impacts are addressed. And you can see the 4 elements are assessing the impacts, integrating and acting on the findings, tracking responses. So it's not just putting the document together and then starting your activities. You are meant to then continue by tracking your responses, communicating impacts, and constantly taking mitigating steps, right? Corporations should take all necessary and reasonable precautions to prevent harm. They should cover impacts caused or contributed to through their own activities and the activities of through relationships with subcontractors. And the obligations or the duty to respect varies according to the size, the risk, the context of the particular business, but it applies to all. And it is an ongoing process, as I said. Who does this apply to? It applies to all companies, regardless of size, and all states. And how are the principles then implemented? So now we come to current day situations and what we see happening. National action plans, because just going back again, because there was unanimous ratification, the adoption of that resolution and adoption of the framework on business and human rights, you would see that the tools, development of national action plans, due diligence reports, and human rights impact assessments undertaken by corporations are tools that are being used across the globe. Developing countries, developed countries are all in the process at some point of developing national action plans. And our recommendation then, just coming now to illicit financial flows, I have not taken us through what illicit financial flows entail, simply because I've assumed that we are all familiar with illicit financial flows. But just to say that for me, one of the reasons why I came into this field is because I realized that Africa loses more money through illicit financial flows than it receives in aid, loans, and investment combined. The economists tell us this. I'm not an economist, and I am not really interested in knowing exactly how much, whether it's 50 billion US dollars or 80 billion US dollars or 1 trillion US dollars. What I learned through this from the economists is that most importantly, we lose more money than we receive. That our dependence on overseas development assistance is unsustainable. We saw this during COVID, and we continue to see this. We saw this during HIV, where if a government prioritizes something else, there's some crisis in another part of the world, funding to the global fund that we then in Africa are dependent on gets cut. And we then have our people dependent on the ARVs, and we are not able to provide them. Dependence on overseas development assistance is unsustainable, and it's not how we want to run our countries going forward. When we need, sure, we need to ask, but at some point we need to actually stand on our own feet as a continent. And one of the human rights principles that's really important, and that actually is meant to guide us on this path, is the obligation that states have not only to spend the maximum available resources on fulfilling their human rights obligations, but also their obligation to mobilize maximum available resources. We're going to have another webinar where we'll talk more about what this obligation entails in practice. But with those principles in mind, what then are the obligations of states and non-state actors in relationship to curtailing illicit financial flows, curtailing the revenue that we lose illicitly, and actually the positive obligation to harness, to mobilize the maximum available resources? What are the obligations of states? So my earlier part of the presentation dealt with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. There, as I said, it was principled pragmatism. It was the middle way between corporate accountability and voluntary regulation or self-regulation. Then comes the African Commission. And in one of my slides, you saw how the issue of Nike was dealt with, Nike sweatshops in Asia, and how the consumers came out in their numbers and Nike had to change their policy on that. And you saw on the other side, the situation in the DRC, where the eastern part of the DRC remains a war zone, all because of coltan. So in the African context, we have a very different reality. And so the African Commission on Human and People's Rights undertook to looking at what corporate accountability, what are the principles of corporate accountability within the African regional human rights system. And they came up with with a few principles that go beyond the UN guiding principles on human and people's rights. So, sorry, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, where the UN guiding principles have the respect, protect, remedy framework. The African Commission adopts elements of that, but it goes further and says that corporations have both positive and negative obligations in relationship to human rights generally, but also to curtail illicit financial flows. It's stated very clearly there. In the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, corporations have a responsibility. And for those of you who are lawyers among us would understand that there's a really big difference between the responsibility to respect and the obligation to respect. There's a very big difference between the responsibility to do no harm, the negative responsibility to do no harm, basically to avoid to do no harm, the negative component of it, and the positive obligation to respect. Okay, so that's one element that the African Commission went further than the UN guiding principles. The second is on fiscal and transparency obligations of non-state actors, where the UN guiding principles on business and human rights did not cover taxation, illicit financial flows, and these fiscal obligations in much detail. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights went much further on that issue. And fiscal reporting obligations of state parties, a third element that takes the framework of corporate accountability much further than the UN guiding principles. Now, in the last few minutes that I have, I'm going to just summarize the policy recommendations that we make in the policy brief that this entire webinar is based on. And firstly, the policy recommendations that arise from the UN guiding principles, from the tools that are embedded within the UN guiding principles. As I said, one of the tools is the National Action Plan. And so we make the recommendation that state parties and national human rights institutions that have been involved in developing national action plans should include strategies to combat illicit financial flows in those national action plans. We also suggest a second type of tool that is used quite frequently in the EU region, which is the tax spillover impact assessments. How does my tax, the bottom line of this tax spillover impact assessment is that states ask the question, how does my tax policy and my framework affect another country's tax base and another country's ability to mobilize tax revenue? So in the African context, this would mean a country like Mauritius or Seychelles that's currently a tax haven, asking themselves when they're putting their national action plans together, and particularly the component dealing with tax spillover impact assessments, how do my tax policies affect the ability of South Africa or Zambia or any other country to mobilize maximum available resources? Okay, so what we're saying is the first recommendation is that we include strategies to combat illicit financial flows in our national action plans. Secondly, that we include tax spillover assessments within the national action plans. And then that non-state actors, including law firms that are putting together their human rights impact assessments, should also address tax issues and mitigate the associated mitigation strategies. So when they, for instance, are advising on financial schemes and developing schemes for their clients, law firms that are also business, that are also covered by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. When they do human rights impact assessments, they need to also include these issues. The policy recommendations that come from the African Commission guidelines, the African Commission's elaboration on corporate accountability, are twofold. Firstly, that the fiscal and transparency requirements that the African Commission has listed needs to be fulfilled, which includes both positive obligations and negative, as I said, right? And then state parties need to comply with the fiscal reporting guidelines. And just in my last two slides, I just want to show you what the fiscal reporting requirements are. And this here, the heading seems to have been cut off, but this deals with the reporting requirements of non-state actors, where they need to disclose the identity of owners, shareholders, local partners. Edith is going to be talking about beneficial ownership disclosure. The African Commission doesn't use that terminology, but I'm sure she will agree that this is what beneficial ownership disclosure is all about, disclosing the identity of owners, the natural persons that are the owners, the shareholders, local partners. Then also fully declaring profits that have been made from the operations in the host country, disclosing financial terms of agreements relating to license fees and tax incentives, tax concessions that have been granted. So all that sort of transparency needs to be included in the reporting to the African Commission. From the state side, they need to then provide detailed information on financial and tax-related issues as well. The expenditure, the incentives, the exemptions that have been provided. They need to re-examine their laws, the tax laws, banking laws, company laws, and look at the regulations that govern the financial sector to particularly assess the vulnerability to illicit financial flows and measures that will be taken to address that. And then to also look at agreements. So not just the laws, but also the agreements, the bilateral investment treaties, the double tax agreements that Edith is going to talk about as well, to look at how those agreements to state parties have the responsibility to report on, and what steps they have taken to address the harmful effect of certain clauses in those agreements, right? I'm going to leave it at that just for the purposes of time, and I think I've been exactly on the mark with this. And to just end with saying that I saw this in one of my old somebody at a business and human rights plenary said this. I recorded it, and I saw this last night when I was preparing for today, that the pursuit of human rights is not just a moral conviction, but it is actually a social and economic necessity. And if we start from this perspective, we then understand why we need to take some of the steps that we're talking about, which in my view are actually low-hanging fruit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asha, for your wonderful presentation. I think one can tell how passionate you are about educating the masses. I think we'll move on to our first intervener, Mr. Jean Balambala. Perhaps you can help us answer the question, how can state and non-state actors be capacitated so that they are better positioned to contribute to mobilize domestic resources and combat illicit financial flows? Over to you.
Merci, merci June.
I will answer to the question asked to me within the framework of this webinar, how the state and non-state actors can be supported so that they are in a better position to contribute to the mobilization of national resources and curtailing illicit financial flows. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to provide my input in this discussion. Following HA, that has Acha, who just talked about the illicit financial flows and promotion of human rights, we can say that financial flows are a phenomenon that impact on governments, especially governments in the mobilization of budgetary resources, which are important factor for funding the sustainable development in the countries. And that is why there were many studies that were made that show that indeed the countries lose more than they get in terms of tapping on their natural resources, in terms of economic growth. So it is very important that we dwell and reflect on this phenomena. And when I say we, it means the actors who are on the ground, whatever state actors or non-state actors. And that is why we believe that there is a number of strategies in terms of references which we can talk about that can assist in curtailing illicit financial flows. And this will enable us to mobilize in an optimal way the domestic resources, feeding our budgets, and finally fund the development objectives, and namely keeping with the human rights, whatever right to education, health, drinkable water, and so on and so forth. So this is what you can say as an introduction. Regarding the state actors, we have to say it because sometimes we believe that the illicit financial flows are a phenomena which is essentially caused by businesses that exploit and tap on our natural resources. But we should say that this process needs the combination of both parties. So regarding state parties, we believe that indeed, we have to provide continuous training to the officials of tax administration and customs administration on the latest method of tracking illicit financial flows. And here there is a number of methodology which exist, cooperation strategies that help us to identify and track the causes of illicit financial flows. And here we can add a number of technologies. It is important that we invest in systems and cutting-edge systems and technology in order to improve customs and tax surveillance. Also, we have to insist on transparency and responsibility and accountability. And on this axis, we have to consider anti-corruption laws in order to strengthen and implement very robust anti-corruption laws to guarantee transparency and accountability within government institutions. We all know that whatever in Africa or in the world, many governments have adopted anti-corruption laws, whatever the Convention of the United Nations or the Treaty on the reduction, prevention, and control of corruption of the African Union. These laws are important elements on which we should act. Also, audits are carried out. We should carry out regular audits in order to identify and remedy to the gaps in the financial management and systems of revenue collection, so that state actors establish and carry out audits to check to what extent the accounts are faithful and transparent. International cooperation is an important axis element. Here we have to share information, strengthen international cooperation in terms of information exchange between tax and customs administration. Initiatives are being launched in this direction with the many bodies such as OEDC that allow exchange of information, even if elsewhere there are some limits, but we have to address them so that such information exchanges are fruitful. The accession to conventions is important because it enables to control illicit financial flows. Here we can quote the case of DAFI, which is a platform that enables member states to evaluate, self-evaluate themselves and set up good practices. And this is very good to control money laundering or control corruption. Tax reforms are very important at the level of state parties. So reviewing of tax laws to reduce the incitations to fiscal evasion. And you know that these laws have to control the bad practices. So the strategy should be assessed, and this should be integrated in the laws. So also a reduction of fraud. We have to set up measures to reduce tax fraud. And it was mentioned by Madam Asha before, there are practice of revenue transfers in jurisdictions which are favorable to businesses. So states should set up control and oversight mechanisms, for example, to stop such movements and flows. Regarding the non-state actors, we can include here organization of civil society, media, including businesses. It is important also to carry out training processes to the organizations of the civil society, and also to enable them exercise the oversight, which it is part of their mandate. Also, we need to get a surveillance body and a process to check what is illicit and illicit. And also, political advocacy and sensitization is very important. For example, what we are doing here is part and parcel to sensitize the populations. Have campaigns, organize campaigns, and Asha has just demonstrated it as regards businesses in relation to human rights and the principles of the United Nations that can help us control such involvements. So work with governments also in order to promote the just and efficient fiscal policies. Also, participation in decision-making process is very important. Why? Because if the struggle against illicit financial flow involves all the state and non-state actors, it is also important that we have among us a dialogue, a structured dialogue process that enable us to organize consultations and dialogue with the government to find out the best policies to contribute in drafting tax laws and the formulation of economic policies, because what we're doing now is not the responsibility only of states, but everybody should be part and parcel of this procedure and process. We should include everyone. We also independent surveillance. The operator of civil society should focus on this independence principle and carry out analysis to identify the policies and use such tools to be able to dialogue with and communicate with public governments. This can be done through public reports, which have to be published, and making them more accessible so that everybody can understand what we mean. international collaboration is very important. Networking, we can see it very clearly. We work as a civil society organization in different platforms, whatever with the civil society. For example, Catsis Network Africa, Palu Network, and other networks and national coalitions, international advocacies to take part to advocacy efforts at the world level for international equitable tax reforms. We have now tabled the draft on the issues of taxes. It is at the United Nations level, and it is important to review such a document and carry out an international advocacy. There is a convention that deals with international equity. Of course, here we are trying to get familiar with the tools, innovative tools that are established every day in order to identify and analyze the illicit financial flows.
In relation with data security, and that will help us to fight against illicit financial flow. So once I'm done with presenting these axes, that can also be developed at the in each state and within the sub-region. We can see that there is this necessity to collaborate and to commit ourselves, even to work in networks. The private sector is important. It should not be forgotten, but we should work towards transparency and support the civil society actors, civil society organization, and promote ethical ways. So non-etatic and non-state and state actors can also contribute in the fight against illicit financial flow and reduce the work towards a better mobilization of national resources. The collaboration between all those actors is very important. So this is what I can say. Thank you very much. Asante sana.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jean Balambala. Messi. We swiftly move on to Ms. Edith Nyabicha, who is eagerly waiting, as you can see, to answer the question, what is the experience of African countries in terms of dealing with double taxation agreements, adoption and implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, development of tax spillover assessments? Over to you.
Thank you so much, June. For the time being, maybe you can be sharing the PowerPoint. And also thank you, Palu, and my fellow panelists for setting the stage on issues regarding illicit financial flows, double taxation agreements, which are critical, and we need to have a further discussion on as we go through this webinar series. June, are you able to share the presentation?
Yeah, I'm working on it. You can just start and then it's sharing right now.
Great. So the main question which I'll be asking ourselves is, what is currently the experience of African countries when dealing with double taxation agreements and the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles and the development of tax spillover assessments? So I'll debunk this into three areas. One, we'll start working on, we'll look at the double taxation agreements, the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles, and the development of the tax spillover assessment. So as I was going through this, I found out that as of 2022, there are over 500 double taxation agreements in force in the African region, many of which were with capital exporting developing countries. So my question is today, do these DTAs really foster foreign direct investments? And I would really want us to ask ourselves this question as we go through this webinar. And what I came to realize is most of the time that these double taxation agreements do not lead to more FDI. So despite having tax treaties with developed countries, there's been a research which has shown that a higher share of FDI in the treaty partner countries is outside the treaty network. Additionally,
interrupt, Edith. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, I can. Maybe you can go to the next slide.
Okay, sure. You can just be letting me know. I'll be sharing.
Great. Then additionally, despite increasing number of tax treaties over the years, the FDI GDP ratio has not experienced an ever increasing trend. So what is currently the experience in Africa? We've seen that the DTAs have negatively affected the revenue mobilization in Africa. And we saw this, I've gone through Ghana's evaluation, and it has shown that this has negatively affected them in the sense that they skew global tax distribution away from capital importing states. And then there's a key problem in negotiating and implementing of the DTAs. What is seen is that the negotiation and implementing the DTA can be challenging for so many African countries due to limited technical expertise. Thirdly, there's the issue of the consideration of the base erosion and profit shifting. So with the rise of concerns with this, so many African countries have become more cautious in negotiating of the DTAs, and this may seek to include the provisions that prevent abusive practices. Lastly, we need to be very careful when we're dealing with DTAs because there are issues regarding the transfer pricing challenges. And in regards to this, we've seen that there's been an issue with transfer pricing when it comes to the African nations. So some DTAs include provisions related to transfer pricing to address these concerns about profit shifting and the transactions between the related parties. So I will continue to ask ourselves, do we really think that do these double taxation agreements, do they really foster direct investments? And what can we do then to have better double taxation agreements? Over, next slide, please. So we'll go to the recommendations, which I do believe will really help in better double taxation agreements. One, I propose that we do need to have, we need to improve the transparency and the levels of treaty negotiation, also to include parliament. In my research, I saw that in countries like Zambia and Uganda, the parliament is not involved in this agreement and in this process. So there's some sort of lack of transparency, and we do not know what exactly is happening in these agreements. And then as a nation, we do then face the consequences of the agreements. Secondly, is the protection of the narrow tax base. So I will encourage the tax authorities to ensure that the tax treaty is not abused and the benefit is not accessible to persons whom it is not intended. And also we need to enhance the management information system and data capturing related to DTAs. This is quite important because the revenue authorities will maintain these information systems, which will enable the cost-benefit analysis and understanding how will this, what is the cost for this agreement and what is the benefit in terms of us entering into this agreement as a nation. Lastly is building capacity, especially for the negotiators. It is evident as an African nation that there's lack of competence or lack of the capacity building with the representatives who are negotiating double tax in the agreements, such that whenever they go to negotiate this, they are at a lower end in the table and not necessarily benefit the respective nations. The next slide, please. So then now we will now go to debunk on the issues on the United Nations Guiding Principles, which Ms. Asha has really delved into it, where she talked about how these principles have become, which were developed by the UN to address the impact of business activities on human rights. And this is critical because we've been able to see that as we're able to deal with issues regarding human rights, then we do also need to ensure that we are also looking at the impact of business activities and issues regarding illicit financial flows. And we can never look at them as silos, but rather look at them concurrently, so that we're able to see how do they provide a framework for businesses and governments and to prevent and address human rights abuses. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Before that, please. Implementation. Thank you. As we go through the implementation, I want us to look at areas in which how can we be able to ensure that as we're going through this principle, how do we are we creating awareness? How are African countries looking at it as a continent? So what I've come to say is that African countries have also shown awareness of the UNGP and as a commitment to integrate human rights and considerations into business practices. We've been able to see that so many nations have ensured that this is something that they're currently going to be looking at, and looking at issues regarding illicit financial flows, beneficial ownership. The Business Registration Service currently is quite entrenched in many African nations, and beneficial ownership regulations are also quite entrenched in many African nations. So this is quite a commitment by the African countries. Secondly is the national action plans. We have seen that also African countries have developed or initiated the process of creating NAPs to outline their approach to implementing the UNGPs at the national level. We've seen this especially with an example like Kenya, which is currently the National Action Plan 4, which is under the OGP. So this is something that African countries are really coming up and entrenching this in their activities. Then another issue which we have seen in terms of implementation is the limited resources and capacity constraints. So there's need for legal and institutional frameworks to support the integration of this human rights into business practices. So yes, this can be into law, but the lack of the frameworks are lacking in the African nation, and also the capacity to implement this and proper implementation is needed. Then, what is the role of the CSOs in this spectrum? I think we as CSOs, the need for advocation for the and adoption and implementation of the UNGP, which is currently very important, and the CSOs are a voice that needs to be heard, and we really need to put our voice out there and advocate for this. So collaborating with key partners, and so that we can be able to support in any way for this adoption to happen. And then sectoral initiatives, where we've seen that there's been sector-specific initiatives, especially in the extractive industries. We've seen this especially in Kenya, where they're also adopting this. So particularly in the extractive industries, where they're working towards adopting responsible business practices in line with the UNGP. Next slide, please. Lastly, we will now need to debunk on tax spillover assessments, which is also an issue that we do need to evaluate as a nation, as Africa, and we just need to identify how do this affect us. So the development of tax spillover assessments, which analyze the impact of tax policies and practices in one jurisdiction or another, has been very evolving. In the area in the international taxation. So tax spillover effects go beyond corporation tax to cover a wide range of tax policies and practices, the income tax, the capital gains tax, and all can be subject or to or other source. So as we're looking at this, this knowledge will really enable us to the development of programs for targeted national tax reforms at reducing harmful spillover effects at each national tax system. So I'll want us to identify what is, how can we be able, as we're looking at the tax spillover assessments, to see how can, what has been the effect in terms of Africa. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as we're looking at the tax spillover assessments, we'll need to look at the base erosion and profit shifting implementation. How is it become in terms of Africa and the country by country reporting? So this will be really essential for us as an African nation to look at this and see how is it concerning us. So we've seen that many African countries have expressed concerns about the erosion of their tax base due to profit shifting by multinational corporations. So countries around the world, including African countries, have been taking steps to implement the base erosion and profit shifting recommendations, which include measures to prevent tax avoidance and address spillover effects. So again, as we go to the country by country reporting, some African countries also may be implementing or considering the adoption of country by country reporting, a key component of the base erosion profit shifting project. So which requires multinational enterprises to disclose information on their global allocation of income, then the taxes paid and other indicators, providing tax authorities with insights into potential spillover effects. As we go to capacity building, so there's need to build the capacity of tax authorities in African countries, which is very crucial for conducting effective spillover assessment. So this involves training tax officials and enhancing their technical capabilities and fostering a deeper understanding of international tax issues. As we go to the regional initiatives, the role of the EU and ECOWAS, EAC is very critical, and other regional tax organizations, which may really play a role in coordinating efforts to address the spillover effects. The collaborative initiatives at the regional level can really help share the best practices and experiences among neighboring countries. As we go to the national legislation and regulatory measures, so we've seen that so many of the African countries may be working on developing or updating their national tax legislation. We've seen that in Kenya, where we want to have, we're reviewing our national tax base and also legislation. And so this could include measures to strengthen the transfer pricing rules, to prevent tax treaty abuse, and also ensure that profits are appropriately taxed. Lastly is on the CSO engagement. I'll never retire to reiterate to say that the role of the CSOs is very critical in ensuring that as we look what the role of the CSOs and how they can play in ensuring that these issues regarding tax bill over assessment, the double taxation agreement, and the UN guiding principles are put into place, that they can be able to advocate for these issues, and we can be able to clearly highlight how can we support the government in the issues and advocate for them. Over to you. Over to you, June. Thank you so much. Over to you, June.
Thank you so much, Edith, for such a wonderful presentation. Indeed, when you talk about double tax agreements, when you hear that Parliament is not involved in the process as is constitutionally required, I'm speaking to the lawyers present in this webinar. We can make them answer those questions in court. We can sue our governments. We can just, the way the Tax Justice Network was successful in helping to nullify the Kenya-Mauritius double tax agreement. So speaking to our lawyers, I think this is something we can look into. So thank you so much to our participants, our panelists. Asha spoke on the general overview of the obligations of our states and non-state actors in curbing illicit financial flows. And Mr. Jean Balambala took us through the requirement for states to maximize domestic resource mobilization in order to curb illicit financial flows. And Edith went specifically into DTAs and tax spillover assessments, where we're seeing countries racing to the bottom to provide unrealistic tax incentives through DTAs and the like. So thank you so much to our presenters. And we have a few questions in the Q&A. I encourage our participants, if you have any question, if you need to ask a question, kindly raise your hand and we'll give you a chance to speak. But we'll start, I think this one was posted when Asha was speaking, and I think it's directed to Ms. Asha. Perhaps you can respond. Please speak on Zimbabwe and the recent gold mafia documentary.
So there were three questions in the Q&A that I saw that probably relate to my presentation. The one is about the gold mafia. The other is about the national action plans and whether training is available, and tax spillover assessments as well. And the third was around harmonization of tax rules between countries to prevent harmful tax competition. So on the gold mafia, I think that documentary really highlighted how complicit and how complicit government officials are in the illicit financial flows, and the number of high-powered individuals that have vested interests in ensuring that the status quo remains the same, remains as it is or gets worse. We would have seen, I'm not going to talk in detail about the gold mafia documentary, but more about what we can learn from it, right? Right now, as we speak, the Africa group is working tirelessly at the UN to advocate for a UN tax treaty at the UN level, right? And this Africa group comprises of ambassadors and representatives of African governments at the UN General Assembly. At the same time, so the UNGP were hosting a very important gathering in New York. At the same time, the Zimbabwe tax representative was there and very vocal and talking about how changes have been made. And all of that is happening at the same time as all these activities that we have heard about relating to the gold mafia. And we know that the gold mafia in Zimbabwe is not a unique situation. My my comment on that to the person who asked the question is, this is why we need a human rights-based approach. As you would have seen from the beginning of my presentation, I was talking about voluntary as opposed to regulatory changes, and voluntary within voluntary self-regulation of corporations. And we were talking about how that has evolved over time, and that even corporations, even the Lord Chancellor of the UK at one point said corporations, expecting them to have a conscience when they don't have a soul to be damned or a body to be kicked, is a pie in the sky dream. My statement around the gold mafia is not just, is to highlight the extent to which those corporations and the individuals in those corporations have partners complicit with them within key positions in government. In South Africa, we experience that state capture that I'm sure many of you are aware of. This is why a strong human rights framework is required. A lot of the initiatives that are happening across this continent and across the world are very, very powerful, very important initiatives. But when you add to that a human rights approach, what you are saying is that it's not up to government to do this because they think it's an important thing to do. But curtailing illicit financial flows is essentially an obligation under international human rights. It is as important an obligation as the prohibition of torture, right? Curtailing illicit financial flows is as important as the obligation to prevent torture. This is the argument that I'm trying to make, and the human rights framework provides us with that. I've been saying is that the human rights framework, as it stands, provides us with those tools to address illicit financial flows in that way, but we are just not doing it. Okay, so I know that you were wanting me to get involved in the gold mafia conversation, looking at whether it's many different dimensions to it, and I hope that this gives you a different perspective on it. Then Charles asked about the national action plans and whether there's training and the uptake of it. Just to say to you that, Charles, Kenya produced a national action plan, and in its national action plan, it included a small paragraph where it looked at reviewing of current trade and investment promotion agreements and bringing them into compliance with the Constitution and with international human rights standards to ensure that they are not used to facilitate illicit financial flows and tax evasion by businesses. So that was what Kenya included in their national action plan. Uganda noted, it wasn't introduced in the plan itself, but it noted in its discussion stakeholder concerns that tax exemptions were not provided transparently and that they were granted only to large foreign companies. So the concern was that it resulted in unfair competition between those who receive tax exemptions and those who don't receive tax exemptions. This, as a human rights lawyer, this could easily be classified as unfair discrimination and challenged. These tax exemptions could be challenged on that basis. So your question was around training. How is it that Kenya and Uganda were able to do this? They received support from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. There are certain international bodies that have civil society organizations that have come up, and there's a whole industry around making the UN guiding principles on human rights effective and implementing them across the board. So there is a training industry in this field, and it's there. When it comes to the tax spillover assessments and capacity building around that, I was pleasantly surprised. I didn't know how effective the Addis Tax Institute is. And yesterday, I heard the representative from the government of Liberia talking about a matchmaking component within the Addis Tax Initiative, so that what happens is a country, let's say Zimbabwe, would like to improve and would like to develop a tax spillover assessment and improve its system. It then writes to the Addis Tax Initiative and requests for a match, and maybe the Swedish tax authority or Finnish tax authority would come on board, and a long-term capacity building joint exchange would be developed. And the government of Liberia, the representative there, was quite vocal about how this has improved their tax system. So I was very, very pleased to hear that. Then harmonization of tax policies. This was one of the agenda items. It's an obligation under the SADC framework. The SADC Protocol on Finance and Investment has one element of tax harmonization and prevention of harmful tax competition. But again, what we see are different parts of systems pulling in different directions. But we have these, my final point is to just say that we have these tools within the international and regional human rights and investment sectors, and we need to use them. The last comment that I would like to make that arises from Edith's presentation is just that what is very interesting to me is in the North, countries of the North are moving towards what they call new generation bilateral treaties, investment treaties, and double tax agreements, while we in Africa are sitting with old generation model treaties and old generation treaties that are still being used, that are still in force, and that we really need to be looking at renegotiating those treaties. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that for now and hope that I've answered all the questions.
Yeah, just to add something from Asha's response, I think just one thing that from the Addis Tax Initiative, ECOWAS has just become a member. I think I just got the email like 2 days ago. They've now become a member of the Addis Tax Initiative, which is a really great move for Africa. This enables also Africa to also be as a regional body to sit at the table and also be part of the discussion. So one of the questions also that I saw is how are the foreign jurisdictions to be considered in the tax spillover assessments to be identified? And under ATI, they've also identified some areas, issues that you can look at. One of them is the economic substance of activities. So it's looking at the assessment, often focused on jurisdictions where MNEs, the multinationals, conduct substantial economic activities. So this involves identifying countries where the MNE has operations, they generate the revenue, and has a significant economic presence. Secondly, is also to look at the value chain analysis. So understanding the value chain of the MNE is very essential. So understanding where the value is going to be created, such as the production, distribution, marketing, research, and development. Thirdly is the presence of subsidiaries and affiliates. So the location of these subsidiaries and affiliates of the MNE, and where they're located and where the tax policies and the practices are going to be affected. Then looking at tax havens and the low tax jurisdictions, which is also something that I think Asha has already alluded to. And then the financial reporting information, the information available through the financial reports, the country by country reporting, which is also something that needs to be looked at. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Edith. We're looking for an intervention from Mr. Jean Balambala. There's a comment here where Mr. John Scaria said, many countries have put in place legal and institutional frameworks to prevent IFFs, but the same do not show impact at the level of implementation. I'm afraid the big multinationals interfered with the whole process, since business and human rights principles threaten their interests. Perhaps you can respond to that and any other question that's still pending on the Q&A, Mr. Jean Balambala.
Thank you very much, June, for asking me to take the floor. I think that at this level, we have to play an important role as an organization of civil society, an important role to play, because indeed we can understand our states because they need resources. But as was mentioned previously, there is a weak level of capacity, whether regarding the resource exploitation or tapping. So we have to resort to multinationals and international companies that have a lot of means at their reach. Yesterday, I had a conference with the ETA, and there was a Chadian friend who was really despaired in front of the power of the multinationals that can influence and impact on our states with tens and hundreds of millions of CFA francs or euros. And the question was to know how such states or governments can resist given the social and economic situation prevailing in our states. So this being said, we have to play an important role as an organization of the civil society. We have to carry out advocacies so that these frameworks which are established, which we do very well, but which are not implemented, that progressively our states indeed do something to implement them. Of course, Asha has presented the framework of human rights in the United Nations, and we can indeed believe that the United Nations will be advocating for this prospect, and efforts should be implemented so that businesses are pressurized so that they implement good practices, and also enable states to implement the legal frameworks which are established. So it is very important that we take good note and that we are aware of the situation and do more advocacy and sensitization, because it is a minority which is in power, but in fact it is the majority that requires assistance. So we have to do lobbying, pressures, advocacy, so that more transparency prevails during the implementation of national policies. This is not a short-term struggle or action. It should be a long-term procedure that requires strategies and consistency. This is what I can say at this stage regarding this situation. In fact, this is what we see everywhere. The policy frameworks are adopted, but they are not implemented because there are a lot of financial stakes and also challenges with the private sector partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jean Balambala, for your insight. Seeing that there are no more questions in the Q&A, of course, we do not want this conversation to end here. Should the panelists be okay, we can share their contacts for you to continue the conversation if you need to ask any questions. But for now, I think we can end here. But I want to give the floor to Mr. Rangarirai Chekova to give the closing remarks, and then we can end.
Okay, thanks, June, and a big thanks to our presenters. the information that you shared was very deep, and it is our hope that we're going to use this information, to do our advocacy work in our respective countries. And I would like to thank our participants also. The questions that you've asked, I think it's really important for us. So just to mention that we have done a number of policy briefs that focus on issues of illicit financial flows. So we are going to have more webinars. So this is a series of webinars on these issues of illicit financial flows and transparency. So this session that we had today is just one of those. We're going to have another one next week on Friday, same time, and then the other one on the 1st of December. So we are going to share with you the presentations, the PowerPoints, and also the actual policy briefs that have been done by our consultant, Ms. Asha. So I will also share the link. We are a membership organization, so if there are any lawyers who want to be members of PALU, when we share these materials, we are also going to share with you a link so that you register and become members. Otherwise, thank you for your time, and see you next week. Over to you, June.
Thank you so much, Ranga. Thank you all. Thank you to our panelists, Ms. Asha Ramgobin, Mr. Jean Balambala, Ms. Edith Nyabicha. We really appreciate your time and the information you've shared with us. Really, truly, it has been successful because of you. And also, not forgetting our attendees. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. For those in East Africa, I think it's very cold, but you managed this cold morning. Thank you so much. We shall end here. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.